All right, what is up, everybody? Welcome back to another day of SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. It is Wednesday, November 17th of 2021. Thank you for tuning into the stream today, whether you are watching me live here or watching this back as a recording. Appreciate you being here. If this is your first time watching the stream, I know we have been getting a ton of new viewers this week, which is amazing. This is a live open Q&A style show where I answer questions about SaberSim, about DFS, whatever you guys want to talk about. We've got some great questions in here today. We'll talk a little bit about the research builds that I like to do. We'll do a couple entry editor demos, or at least one quick demo of a specific use case for the entry editor. We'll talk a little bit about variance and the sim variance slider and whatever else you guys got. I don't have too many questions in my queue here today. So great day to ask your questions if you have them. Later this week, one more piece of housekeeping here. Later this week, we will be putting out a video with Max walking through his live NBA DFS process to build his lineups for a slate. I know that video has been pretty highly anticipated. I have already put out two similar videos walking through my baseball and my football process, which actually are a little bit similar overall. If you watch both of those videos, high variance sports, high correlation sports, I do a lot of similar things there. But people have been asking a lot for NBA, and that is on the way. And it will be a little bit interesting to get somebody else's point of view, somebody else's process, because I know you guys have seen mine now twice, so you get to see Max's process for NBA. So look forward to that coming out here later in the week. Otherwise, I think I will go ahead and just jump right into it. Let me get the app up on the screen here, and we'll start answering some questions. We've got here a 11-game NBA slate tonight. Not sure what we've got on the NHL side. Let's take a look. Let's see. How many games do we have? Maybe I'll play a little hockey DFS tonight. It seems like they kind of flip-flop. So only 3 games. So I got to remember on the small NBA slate nights that's when the nights all the NHL teams are playing, which I guess makes a little bit of sense, right? Playing in the same stadium most of the time. But anyway, 3 games of NHL, 11 games of NBA here. A lot to talk about. I'm going to start here with a question that came in through our support inbox, and it is about a specific very specific kind of question use case here on how to use the entry editor. So give me just a second here and we'll get this pulled up. So this question here was from Phil, and let me grab this here. Let me grab this. Okay, so Phil said that he has a single entry lineup and a 20 entry lineup, and he's uploading them to the DraftKings, and he's getting a message basically saying successfully uploaded 1 of 21. So one that should say 1 of 21, not 1 of 211, but 1 of 21 have been uploaded. So just overall having some issues. You know, I've entered a single entry and I know exactly what single entry lineup I want to use for that. And I also have a 20 entry max and I know what 20 entry lineups I want to use. How can we use the entry editor to make this easier, right? And this is basically almost, exactly what the entry editor is designed for, is to smooth all of these things out. So I'm going to totally start from the beginning here. I have an entries file that I've kind of created to show this process. So you'll go to the entries, you'll upload your entry file, right? So if you have only entered these 2 contests, you've entered the single entry and the 20 entry max, the easiest way to do this is just to click this download template file from DraftKings, and it will just download all of your entries. But I actually have a test file that I'm going to use here for this specifically, and upload this. And you can see here, I've got a 20 entry max quarter jukebox and the $5 high five, right? So let's say in this particular case, I'm going to build my single entry lineup first. So we'll just, for the sake of doing this here, we'll just build like 1. Well, I'm going to build 10, so it'll let me build it. But we'll just use whatever the first lineup that comes out here is. And I know, Phil, in this particular question that you said it sounds like maybe you hand built your lineup on DraftKings. I'll talk about maybe how to do that, or how to deal with that in a second here. But if you built this single entry lineup on SaberSim at all, you don't need to go through the process of manually entering it yourself. So I wasn't totally sure exactly how you got to that lineup. I'll talk about what to do if you're hand building it here in a second. But assuming you built it on SaberSim, let's just say that this is the lineup, right? So we're going to play this. This is our single entry. We can click save, And just so we don't get confused here, one thing I like to do is I just like to always rename this build here. So I click that little pencil icon up top, and I'm going to call this my single entry lineup. And that just makes it very easy to see. We'll see in a second in the entry editor what that build is. So now let's build our 20 entry max, right? So now we're going to do the same thing, and we're going to pick our right sliders for the contest, and we're going to build 20 lineups. And I'm sure, you're actually building these lineups. Maybe you have a little bit more thought behind this, editing your exposures, your projections, whatever you might be doing in your individual process. But we'll just use the first 20 we get here for this. And perfect. Welcome, everybody. I see there are a few other people that have joined up into the stream now. Hope you guys are all having a great Wednesday here. Looks like another Cade night coming, so that's fun. He had a great game last time he played. So anyway, let's go ahead and rename this here. We'll call this our 20 entry lineups. Okay, great. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go back to the entry editor, and we're going to fill these entries into our contests, right? So what we'll do first is we want to just check the lineups that we want to enter, right? Or we want to fill first. So we'll fill the single entry lineup first. So we're just going to we're going to uncheck the 20 entry max. We're going to leave the single entry max checked, and we'll go ahead and we'll go here. Right now, since we named it, very easy to see, we'll see single entry lineup, and we can just fill it with the rank fill method since it's just a single lineup. And you can see now that has our single entry lineup in it. Now we can uncheck that one, check the 20 max, and use the 20 entry lineups. Right? 20 entry lineups is what we want. We can use the rank fill method here in this case too, and we're good to go. Now we can check this back in, download all entries, download and open DraftKings will just take you immediately to the right page on DraftKings to do it. You can save the file, go to your upload here, and then you should see a much better looking message here. Successfully uploaded 21 of 21. Now, let's just say, for example, we've gone in and edited your lineup at some point, right? And maybe you've hand built or tweaked your lineup somehow, right? We have this single entry lineup here. Let's see, is this it? It's not going to be very easy to find, but one of these lineups is my single entry lineup. Maybe it's this one. It's probably sorted one way. No, okay. So one of these entries is my single entry lineup. And let's say I've gone in and I've edited it and hand built it and tweaked it or whatever, and I'm happy with that. And later towards lock, right, I want to update this here. And I only want to update my 20 entry lineups, right? I don't want to mess up my single entry that I hand built and I put into the site myself, but I want to update my 20 entry max lineups, right? So we can do that very easily as well. So what we'll want to do here is, let's say now we're going to run a new build, right? So now this is our updated, this is right before lock. We're doing everything again, and we're getting our fresh 20. And I'll cut this one off a little bit quicker because we only need the 20. So we'll just grab the 20 lineups, right? This is our pre-lock, our updating our 20 max, right? And again, love the idea of updating the names here. I think it just makes it super easy. So we'll call this updated 20 entry lineups. And click OK there. And now we're going to go back to our entries tab, right? Okay, so now what we're going to do, same deal. We're going to uncheck this here. Click Fill Contest with Lineups. We're going to make sure we have our updated 20 entry lineups, and we're going to click Rank. In this particular case, we don't want to mess with the single entry because it's the old single entry that we built earlier. We hand built on the app. We changed our lineup. We want to leave it alone. So in this case, we're going to leave it unchecked, and we're going to click Download All Entries and do the same thing here. Download and open DraftKings. And we're going to get this message here when we go back to the app that says your entry file is incomplete. You're only downloading 20. Right? You unchecked single entry. You're only downloading your 20 entry max. And it's going to ask you, are you doing that on purpose? Did you want to get all of your entries? Because you don't accidentally want to leave one behind. But no, in this case, we're saying, no, that was on purpose. My single entry lineup is already set on DraftKings. I only want my 20. And I'm going to go ahead and click download 20 entries. Get that. Go back here. Upload the most recent file we got. And in this case, it's just going to update and freshen up just those 20. So overall, it should make your process of managing these different lineups that you have in different contests a lot easier. You don't have to go into the CSVs at all. It should smooth everything out quite a bit for you. It takes a little bit of practice here, just a little bit of getting familiar with the tool, but once you've got it, I think you'll find that it's pretty easy to use. So Phil, I will send you over a recording to this live stream here. Oh, Phil's here. Awesome. Great. I'm glad you were able to make it. So yeah, he said, you discovered my problem. I didn't check or uncheck the boxes. Yeah. So again, you can check the specific entries that you want to download or whatever here, and then just make sure when that dialog box pops up that you select the one that applies to you. Something important to note too, just since I kind of glossed over it pretty quickly here, is so if you uncheck that single entry, right, and then click download all entries and click download and open, it's going to take you to DraftKings, right? It's going to open up a new tab. It's going to take you here. That dialogue, that pop-up shows up back on the other tab. So you have to answer this dialogue before you can actually download the file. So just don't get tripped up there if you pop up this DraftKings and you're like, wait, I didn't see the message Jordan was showing me. How do I get there? It's back on the actual SaberSim app where you can answer that. So, but that's it. So I'm glad that was helpful. And I'm glad you made it here live, Phil. So that's great. Cool. All right. I'm going to answer. I see a few questions have come in here live. Welcome again, everybody. I'm going to answer a few of these questions that came in through our Office Hours channel in Slack before the start of the show. Want to answer things in roughly chronological order that they're coming in. And Toasted Taters has one, and this is a fun one. This will be a fun one. He said, if research build works best on 0010, but decreases the accuracy or effectiveness on slates that have sim variance less than 10, what's the best way to do a research build for those contests? So start from the beginning here, because there are some terms, I think, here that maybe people watching really don't know what we're talking about. So what we are referring to when we talk about a research build and we talk about 0010, right? It is these builds that I like to run as a part of my research process. And what you essentially do is you set the sliders to 0 correlation, 0 ownership fade, and 10 sim variance. And I like to build 1,500 of these. And what they essentially do is when you have the slider set this way, you take, for the first lineup you're building, you take a random single game simulation from our thousands of game simulations of each game, use the projections that those players scored in all of those single game sims, and build the optimal lineup you can with those projections. It's the optimal lineup for a single simulation of the slate. Then you go on to the next one, and then the next one, and then the next one. And you get, in effect, this ability to simulate out the slate 1,500 times. And what I like to use with that information is that I like to look at how often that player is showing up in the optimal lineup when the slate is simmed and compare that against projected ownership to make a determination of whether or not I should use that player. And I think it's very valuable. I think it's a very interesting research tool. But one thing I've been talking about here a little bit recently, particularly with NBA, is that kind of like and I think also too, I want to stress this because I think there's some language in this question here, right? That it works best on 0010, but decreases accuracy versus effectiveness. I want to be like totally clear of why I am cautious about doing this for NBA, right? Because the fundamental assumption that I am making when I do a research build is that the probability of a player showing up in the mathematical actual scoring optimal lineup at the end of the slate is approximately close enough to the percent chance of that player showing up in the winning lineup in the contests I'm playing that I can treat that number as the same. But that number is not actually the same, right? In the contest you are playing any given night, the winning lineup in your contest, the big score lineup, is not generally going to be the actual optimal highest scoring lineup that you could have scored, right? Because you don't need that, right? You're just trying to beat, let's say you're playing a 10,000 person single entry contest. You're just trying to beat 10,000 other lineups in the contest. You're not necessarily trying to make the optimal, right? That's not the goal. But we can approximate that some of the time, right? And in sports and slate sizes and contests where your sim variance slider by default is going to be very high, I think that approximation is better. So for example, for a main slate, right? If we look at the NFL Sunday main slate and we switch over to GPP settings for a 150 max contest over 50K entries, the default value for sim variance is already very high. You need basically that level of variance where you're using single game simulations to just be successful in the contest. That implies that the winning lineups in contests of this size are going to approach the optimal highest scoring lineups, right? That approximation is very close. In NBA, on the average night, it's a lower variance sport here. That approximation is going to be worse, right? because the variance required to win the contest is much lower, right? So when you are trying to approximate the percent chance a player has of being in the winning lineup in NBA by running research builds at 0-0-10, that approximation is getting worse. And I think that's important to note. I think that's just an important thing to keep track of. Now, in terms of like what's a better way to do the research build, I've been thinking about this a lot recently, honestly. And I don't know if I have like a perfect answer at the moment. I was even talking about this with a friend of mine last night at the bar. But I think what's tricky here is that running this build at 0-0-10 is a very unique setting. Like something is happening here at 0-0-10 that is kind of unique to 10 because it is a true simulation. They're only going to play all the basketball games once tonight. So if you're trying to like simulate out the slate and see what could happen, the only way you can really like accurately do that is at 0-0-10. So I think rather than saying what's a better settings to use for the research build, I would say it is a better, instead of saying like, I want to pick better settings to use for my research builds for NBA, I would say approach your research builds that you're doing in NBA with a little bit more caution, right? Maybe if, it's ultimately, I don't know what your process is doing that you're doing in the research builds. What I like to do is I like to look for an NFL, for example, I'll look for players that are showing up in 10% more optimal lineups than their projected ownership, or are over-owned by 10% or more based on how often they're showing up in that build. That's one thing I like to do for NFL. I would say for NBA, let's just run one and see what it looks like, because it should build pretty fast. For NBA, I would just kind of take some of these conclusions with a little bit more of a grain of salt. And maybe if you're seeing a player that has let's just look. Let's just see what we get. We'll let this build here. And again, to be like completely honest, this is something I'm kind of still like thinking through on my end as well. Like I don't know, I don't have the 100% satisfying answer here of what the best way to approach this is. I'm not doing a lot of these builds for NBA, again, because there's so much late swap news. There's so much news breaking that I don't know how useful it is necessarily to run these builds before lock at 7 p.m. Eastern and figure out how you're going to be perfectly leveraged on a player playing in a basketball game at 10 o'clock Eastern, right? In football, almost the majority of the games are on at 1 p.m. Eastern, and the late swap window, like news doesn't break as significantly in NFL. It does, right? And you can react to it when it does, but it doesn't break as consistently and significantly as it does in NBA, right? But we could look at this here and like, hang on. Okay. So we could look at this here and say like, okay, our greatest leverage play on the slate at the moment, the player that people seem to be undervaluing the most, Chris Porzingis is showing up in almost 15% of optimals, right? And is only going to be 5% owned. And that's maybe a positive leverage play, a guy you want to be over the field on. But they're playing in Phoenix, probably a game that starts at 9 or 10 p.m. Eastern. And like, what if the state of this game changes significantly by that time, right? Like, what if is Luka's hurt, right? But like, what if Luka ends up getting ruled in or something? I don't know. Like, something could happen to this game that changes this anyway. And I don't want to be running research builds every single lock to determine how my new perfect exposures are going to be. So I just haven't very much for NBA. But with all that said, if you want to do it and you're finding it useful, at least to get an idea of the slate context, I would say, where I would think I would be probably the most cautious is be cautious of research builds that are telling you to fade very high value plays that are also going to be very highly owned, right? Because these plays that are going to be very good value plays, where's the value column? Oh yeah, right? Like these plays are going to be consistently showing up here as the negative leverage plays when you're running research builds, because if we're looking at especially guys like Dean Wade and Naz Reid and Osman, right? Like if any player in your set of simulations that builds that lineup outscores, like you can build a more optimal lineup than 10% using Wade or Naz Reid or Cedi Osman, they're not going to show up in that lineup, but they're still 7x values. And they're still very good plays. Like, this is the discrepancy of the difference between the optimal lineup you could have built versus the winning lineup in the contest. That's kind of the discrepancy, is that like Dean Wade's optimal percent chance of showing up in the optimal lineup might be only 17%, and he's going to be 21% owned. But his chance of showing up in the winning lineup here could be 30%, right? Depending on how owned he is. And I think it's in particular on slates where you end up with these players that are going to be spectacularly highly owned, that are really good values, right? The Drummond slates that we've had where Embiid is out and Drummond's been like 4.5K, not the ones recently so much, but the ones where he's like 4.5K. If you're running research builds and you're seeing that, you know, Drummond's going to be 60% projected owned and he's only showing up in 50% of optimals, right? Well, yeah, anytime another center is the optimal center in that set of game sims, Drummond's not going to be used, but that doesn't mean Drummond is necessarily a play you want to be under the field on. So overall, I still think, because the 0-0-10 research build is a unique build, it reflects individual slate simulations, that there is no other way to do it. You can't just turn sim variance down and get the same information out of it, because at that point you're just building lineups, right? You're actually just building lineups that like you could enter even, right? So you have to run it at 0-0-10, but I would approach it with a little bit more of a grain of salt here. And I think where it would be useful, I think where it can still be useful is on the positive leverage side of things, right? Because if Porzingis is showing up, and again, these ownerships are early, like I think if Luka's actually, is Luka out? I feel like he's hurt. Yeah, okay, so Luka's already ruled out. If Luka's out, Porzingis is going to be a lot higher than 5% owned. But let's just assume that this was true, right? If this is his ownership value, and this is how often he shows up in the actual optimal lineup, then he has to show up in the winning lineup for the contest more frequently than he's owned, right? So I think looking for positive leverage for low-owned plays on your NBA slate, the research build can still be valuable. But if you're looking for players to fade, I would approach with a bit of caution, because how often the player shows up in the optimal lineup, they're probably, especially for very well projected plays, they're going to be showing up in the winning lineup more than their optimal percent chance would indicate. So definitely like kind of a little bit more on the theoretical side. Hopefully I didn't just completely lose anybody there. But if you've kind of been following along on my streams recently here, talking about these research builds and going through this here, this has definitely been kind of a common thread running through so far this season. And it's something that I'm still thinking about, and like definitely still kind of piecing together in my head the best way to deal with this, the best way to think about this. But yeah. That's kind of my stance overall. And again, for full transparency, like I'm really actually not doing these research builds very much for NBA, because I'm counting on late swap giving me that edge instead, especially for big slates. For small slates like last night, I think you could have gotten away with doing these and finding some leverage on the field that way. But like 11 game slate tonight, my edge, like what I'm basically counting on for happening for these big 11 game slates, is just some news breaking, even if it's just somebody starting in one of these games that wasn't expected to, not even a big name player getting ruled out, but some news breaking over the course of this slate that the field's going to suboptimally swap to, and then getting most of my edge from there. Because again, we can figure out exactly what the perfect leverage plays are at 7 p.m. Eastern, but when you're late swapping for the 6 o'clock games and the slate has changed significantly because of some news, your research build isn't so useful anymore. A guy that was a good fade may not be anymore. A guy that was a good play may not be anymore because of the slate context. So anyway, let's move it along here and keep going forward here. So this was a question from Redskin Golf here. And he said, wait, I lost. Oh, last night when I was trying to late swap for NBA, I kept getting an error message on DK when uploading my new lineups. All 20 lineups had errors. I'm still new, but had used late swap last week and had a new issue. Not sure if I did something wrong. I'll go back and watch the swapping feature video and wanted to put it out there. Yeah, so I would say if you're getting errors on your upload when you are late swapping, the best thing I can advise, the most important thing I can advise, is to start over with a fresh entries file. Right? What is probably happening, which is almost certainly happening here, is that somehow your what we think your entries are on SaberSim have gotten out of sync with what you actually have entered on DraftKings. And you have some players in your lineups on DraftKings where their games have already started and SaberSim doesn't realize that those players are actually in the lineup, so it's swapping incorrectly. So you can just fix this very quickly by just clicking the Upload New Entries tab, clicking Download Template File from DraftKings, saving the file, and then re-uploading and just starting fresh. And actually, this will be useful because I do have different entries, right? So now it's going to load all of my entries here. And we'll get kind of a fresh entries thing here. Hang on. I'm going to do a hard refresh here. And see if we can get this to pop up. I was using a test file before. Okay, interesting. So let's try this. Either way, okay, yeah, there we go. So there's all of the actual entries I'm playing tonight. So I think it just got a little jammed up there. But that's the easiest thing to do, and that will get everything back in sync correctly. And then you can late swap, and you can go forward from there. That should generally resolve any issues there. If you are still getting errors there, one of the other things I would definitely recommend is just make sure you're looking at the right slate. Like you're downloading files for the right slate. You're uploading. You have the right slate selected. Right. I think that could be something that's going wrong. Otherwise, then I think the most important thing you could do, or the best thing you could do, is just shoot us a quick message, either email support@sabersim.com or in the support channel in Slack, and we can figure out what's going on. But I would say 99% of issues where you are getting an error on your upload to DraftKings can be resolved by just re-downloading the file from DraftKings and re-uploading. So. Let's see. Question from Jared here. And guys, I do see all the questions coming in YouTube chat. I promise we will get to everything. I'm just going to continue rolling through the questions that came in before the start of the stream today. Jared said, can you explain how the unique entry feature works when you are entering contests? For example, how would the unique feature work if I was entering just one 20 max contest? Or does this feature only work when you're entering multiple contests? Yeah, it really only does something when you're entering multiple contests, right? So like, for example, I could go here and select just one 20 entry max and fill this with a 20 entry build of lineups and use the unique fill method, but it's not going to do anything differently in this case. Using a unique lineup from this pool of 20 lineups, filling a 20 entry contest is going to do the same, is going to have the net same effect as using rank or exact match in this particular case, right? Because they're all going to the same contest. What unique really does, and what's useful for unique, is and how I typically use it almost every single night, is I'm going to be playing these 47 lineups for tonight for this slate. And I don't want to duplicate myself anywhere. I want a unique lineup in every single contest that doesn't show up anywhere else. So to do that, I would go and build 47 lineups, set the settings to something like defaults, and I would set this to 47. And I would build these 47 lineups and then use the unique fill method to fill them. And then the entry editor is going to make sure a unique unduplicated lineup goes into every single entry randomly. So it's filled randomly. It's not filled. It's using the top 47 Saber score lineups as the lineups, but it's putting them into contests randomly. So it might end up, a lineup might end up in the quarter jukebox. It might end up in the $3 3 max. It might end up in the $5 single entries. It could end up anywhere. So when we go over here, we'll go back to entries real quick, and we can pick this and say 47 lineups, fill uniquely, and now I'm going to have a unique lineup in every single contest, right? And the fill method is changed to unique. So let me actually go ahead and enter these now because I haven't done that yet today. Cool. So hopefully that helps. Steve said, you always talk about variance setting 10, pulling info from one sim. Are you able to tell us how many other sims are used for the different settings? I unfortunately don't know exactly how many sims are used for the other settings, but it basically, it's not exactly a linear scale here. So it's not exactly as if like if this is 1, this is 2, and this is 3, and this is 4. Obviously, that wouldn't be the case anyway. But because we're talking about like it's a scale from using all of our simulations, thousands of sims here at 0 to 1 here, right? Like the numbers of how many sims are used here at the 1, 2, and 3 settings are like much higher here. I'm trying to think about what actually curve that would look like. It's I don't know. I don't know exactly the best way to describe it actually. But the buckets get smaller as you move along the spectrum here. Is about as much like information as I really kind of know here in terms of how the sims go. So Don said, would it be fair to think of the numbers as a reverse percentage? What do you mean? You may have to give me a little bit more information about that in terms of, first of all, I'm assuming you're talking about the sim variance numbers, but also what you mean by reverse percentage. Let me know. 8 is using 20% of sims. Yeah, that is probably the best way to think about it. That probably doesn't work. That's not going to work exactly mathematically right. So I will say this. So like we're simulating every game thousands of times, right? The drop here, there's a relatively like significant drop in terms of impact just from going from sim variance off, which is basically only used for cash, to the point where we're bucketing sims at all, right? But then from there, it's a fairly gradual step down from 1 to 10. I think that's a fine way of kind of thinking about it in your head. That is not literally what is happening here, right? It is not 90%, 80%, 70%, 60%, 50%. But I do think that is actually a good way of thinking about it in your head here for approximating it here. So, yeah. Cryptic Kevin said, to my understanding, the larger the number, the smaller the pool of game sims you are looking at. That is correct. And it is 1 game simulation at 10. And it is all the game simulations at 0. And it scales from there. The bucket of game simulations is getting smaller as we move along. So, yeah. I'm going to move us along here. And Cryptic Kevin also said earlier here, we'll answer this one. Is there a way to set things, groups, etc., so that I only have exposure to a player when paired with another specific player? There is not at the moment. One thing that I will note here is that a lot of the reason for player groups on a traditional optimizer is to account for correlations, right? To say, I want like pair these players that are positively correlated together. So use one only if you have the other, and don't use these players together, etc., right? We have a more nuanced approach to correlation here with SaberSim, right? Because we have the game simulations, we can see exactly how correlated a certain player is to one another. Actually, a single game is a bad example. But we can see precisely how correlated players are to one another on the average, and then make use of the correlation slider, right? So we can see exactly what Mahomes' correlations are to other players playing in the game, and then use the correlation slider to weight that appropriately, right? Because there's obviously like a limit, right? Like if I told you, you know, you wouldn't necessarily want to like roster a player that didn't score a lot of points purely to have that correlation, right? There's some threshold where like I want to use this player when he also has a high scoring output when this other player is in the lineup, right? And that's kind of what happens here with SaberSim, because all of this is taken into account, right? So like correlation is weighted. We're not maximizing correlation in every lineup, but we want to account for correlation, and it does so in a way that's a little bit more nuanced than player groups. Now, with all that said, one of the things that we do have planned for a future update is we want to give people a little bit more control over what certain player combinations look like on step 3, so that you could build your lineups here and then go through and scan and remove and add lineups that do have certain combinations of players. because there's not a very easy way to do that at the moment. So that is something we've talked about adding here. But we won't, I think it is unlikely that we will ever have a like traditional player group setup that you set prior to the build. Because frankly, like that is actually really what we're trying to get away from. Like that process of setting player groups for every single team on the slate potentially, and then having to update when news breaks and things change and quickly adjust all that, right? Like I think that's actually like a bit of a flaw of traditional tools, or something that just ends up being very difficult for people to do accurately. And we've kind of attempted to solve that problem here with our correlations. So Michael said, would you recommend adjusting build settings for late swap to reflect less variance? I think that can be a pretty good idea, especially if there's big news that breaks and you think that if you think that, like, especially I'm playing a lot of contests at like relatively low stakes, right? A lot of stuff under $3. And I just know that most people playing these NBA contests aren't going to late swap when news breaks. So I care less at that point about accounting for maximum variance or even ownership fade, really. And I just want to get a lot of those new best plays in that I know are going to be suboptimally owned. People are going to be too far under, right? So I often end up turning down, for NBA in particular, I do end up turning down variance a little bit as the slate goes on and as bigger news breaks, because I care less about high variance plays and more just want to pack in some of those best plays that have now opened up that the field is going to be under owning almost certainly, especially at the low stakes. At higher stakes, there's probably still a good reason to keep variance a little bit higher because you know that the field is going to swap a little bit more readily. But at low stakes, I don't think the field's going to swap optimally. So I find myself turning variance down a bit as the slate goes on. But KC said, just came online. Forgive me if I already asked. You recommended doing backtesting yesterday using weeks previously run. You specifically said something about using actual ownership. I can't find this on the player pool. Where's this feature? So I was talking about a little bit about this yesterday. This isn't a feature here that's like in the app at the moment. We don't have actual ownership values. What I was referring to yesterday is just kind of checking yourself to see how owned players are, especially like the big core pivot players that kind of the slate revolves around, or players that you are updating ownership for. And you can literally just check in your contests themselves and see how owned those players are. And I think doing that over a period of time will give you some sense of intuition about how ownership tends to fall on in different situations. How does ownership tend to fall on players that are very popular or have a high point per dollar value because an injury has taken place that day? Like tonight, I think this is Luka's first game out, right, since he got hurt. So like studying and seeing how the field reacts to the Dallas ownership is interesting, or Cleveland too, right? Cleveland's going to be pretty chalky as well. How do players react to value plays on teams that are perceived as good versus teams that are perceived as bad, or on teams that are playing in a game with a big a high total versus a low total? Like just kind of studying what that is actually looking at, like how owned players actually end up being, will improve your intuition of ownership projections over time, right? That's what's kind of happened to me. That's the first thing I check. Like pretty much after every single lock, I'm like curious just how owned players are. And I kind of have a sense based on SaberSim's ownership projections and some of my own research I'll do before a slate of who I expect to be chalky. And it can be valuable to look at that and see, like, were we right? Were we wrong? Who were we wrong on? So, but there isn't unfortunately at the moment, there is no tool to pull in actual ownerships into the app itself. So. Follow up here on the stacks thing. Cryptic Kevin said, so essentially we are looking at getting beyond straight up player stacks. SaberSim is trying to give you optimal correlation without manual stacking. That's exactly right. And I guess I kind of maybe glossed over this here, wrapping up this question. So let's go back into it. And I cut that build off too. So I actually want to actually build a set of lineups here. And let me go back here and talk in a little bit more detail. So you will select a certain contest here, right? So we'll say a 20 max, let's say instead, 50K. And we have the correlation slider at 6, which has been a back-tested value of how much correlation it makes sense to get, especially when considering how much ownership fade and variance we're also including in these lineups, right? How much should we value when we're deciding which player is going to go into every lineup, right? How much should we value how correlated that player is to other players in the lineup when we decide what player to use? So this correlation slider is what allows you to have the nice big typical stacks that you would expect to see in your lineups in step 3 without setting a rule. But it also allows for certain, like beyond that, it also allows for other correlations to show up in your lineups at the rate that makes sense for that particular contest and team and slate without having to go in and set rules. So we'll see what this looks like here in just a second here. Let this build wrap up. Okay, cool. So we'll make 2 quick adjustments here. And we'll look at the stack types, right? So again, that correlation slider is what it's allowing us to get. Oh God, the slate is going to be so ugly. Flacco's starting. AJ Dillon's going to be so owned. Man, this is going to be a weird slate. But it's the correlation slider is what's like helping us get this QB +2 with 1 run back without having to set a single rule, because all these players are correlated to one another. But it is also what allows other combinations of certain players to show up. Like, let's see, this lineup doesn't really have one, but this one does, right? By pure, basically the correlations of the players and where the correlation slider is set. We have this lineup where Michael Carter is showing up along with the Jets D because those players have a correlation, right? Those players are not grouped. We didn't have to set a player rule that says only use Michael Carter or only use Jets D when the other is in the lineup. But this lineup got created here where that correlation exists, and because the players because they have that correlation, right? And that value is set. We also have a QB +1 stack here because Cam Newton is a running quarterback, and his correlations with his top end receivers are typically lower than pocket passers, for example. Right? Let's see if we can find another one here. This is actually a really interesting idea here of how you can have this opposite effect too, right? AJ Dillon and Devontae Adams are showing up in a lineup together. I would suspect that these players have a very light negative correlation. And they do. They have a negative correlation of -0.03. Commonly, what you will hear in the DFS space is that you should never play negative correlated players together. Ever, ever, ever. You can't do it because they're negative correlated, right? But what that lacks in nuance is that there is a spectrum of negative correlation, right? There's a difference of playing AJ Dillon with the Vikings defense, for whom he has a negative 0.35 correlation, and with Devontae Adams, for whom he has a negative 0.03, very, very small correlation. And for this particular lineup, it's likely that there was a set of game sims used where the Packers just had a very good offensive day, and those 2 players were viable in this lineup together because their raw upside at their ownership, which again, this is probably not right at the moment, allowed them to show up in this lineup together, surpassing that correlative weight of their -0.03 correlation, right? And we also have 2 other players that are positively correlated in this lineup, right? So again, we have the Joe Flacco, Michael Carter, Keelan Cole with Mike Gesicki run back, right? All of these players probably have positive correlations, right? Or at least they're all positively correlated to the quarterback in the lineup. But we also have this Tyreek Hill and Amari Cooper positive correlation that showed up in the lineup, again, because of that correlation, right? So we're allowing like all of the different complicated correlations that show up in a football game to kind of be weighted appropriately for the contest you're playing and for how strong those correlations are without having to set player groups that force these things to all show up as if all positive correlations were the same and all negative correlations were the same. That's really, I guess that's the fundamental flaw of thinking about stacking rules and player groups, is that they make the assumption, even if you knew the exact correlations between players, or even if you knew exactly which players were correlated to one another, there's still an assumption there that all correlations are equal. all positive correlations there is a positive correlation and a negative correlation, and you need to pack as much positive correlation into the lineup while avoiding all negative correlations. And that's not actually really the case of what wins these contests. And that's part of the value here. So again, we didn't set a single rule. So with all that said, we do want to add something in this step 3 here to control when these things are showing up in your lineups more. Like, you can go in and say, show me only the lineups that have a QB +2 with 1 run back here, and we can do it, right? But there isn't a very easy way to say, show me all the lineups that have a opposing wide receiver mini stack in the lineup. There's just as unfortunately like no way to see that at the moment. Or show me every lineup where I stack my running back with my defense. So that is a little bit of a limitation at the moment, and it's something that we want to add support for in the future. But at the moment, there's not other than just going through and looking at them, there's not a super easy way to see that. So Kevin said, I will say the ability to view correlation was something I used to solve for on my own and took an extensive amount of time. SaberSim making this info available was absolutely key to bring me in. Yeah, it's really, really powerful. And I think it answers in a very precise way questions that elsewhere in the industry you're like throwing darts and trying to just like make guesses, right? I mean, even down to like, what is the difference between a player like Mahomes' positive correlations to his top receivers versus a player that runs the ball a lot, like a Josh Allen, right? Like, we can just see that it's quantified. And then even better, not only is it quantified and laid out clearly in front of you, it's incorporated naturally into the lineups themselves. One thing I see happen often is there will be questions here about like, why am I getting lineups that don't have stacks at all? Or why am I getting lineups that have big stacks or very small stacks or things like that? And if you actually go in and look at what these stacks look like, there's often a answer that makes sense to that question. Why is there 1 QB +0 with a 1 run back lineup in my first 100 lineups of this pool of 500 that have no wide receivers stacked with the quarterback? Well, it's because it's a Lamar Jackson lineup. Now, is this a good lineup you want to play? That's up to you. You don't have to. Maybe you don't want to play a QB +0 lineup, right? Maybe Lamar Jackson's top end ceiling potential still requires Mark Andrews or Marquise Goodwin to go, or Marquise Brown to go off, right? But this is the exact kind of player you would probably expect to see in this lineup. And you do. Why do I have 1 QB +4 player in my lineup? Well, it's Aaron Rodgers on a week where there's a ton of value on the Packers because Aaron Jones is out, right? Do you want to play this lineup? Maybe not. But we've taken into account like the upside of these players and the ownership and the correlations of them. And this lineup shows up as one of the first, as the top 28 lineup in this pool of 500 for this contest, right? The players that are showing up in QB +1 stacks are not always going to be rushing quarterbacks, right? There's some Mahomes lineups here, but we do see definitely a little bit more of a concentration of rushing quarterbacks showing up here. The Mahomes lineups are probably showing up because the Chiefs are always so expensive. So it's just way more easy to stack just one of them with Mahomes than it is to stack like 2 or 3. But like, you can just see this. It's basically just like a stack that shows up because it's price inefficient to make any bigger. And also Cam Newton, Russell Wilson, Lamar Jackson, running backs. Baker shows up here. Kind of weird one. But quarterbacks that run the ball, right? And don't necessarily need to get 2 wide receivers to have ceiling games for themselves to have a ceiling game. So anyway, bit of a rant there. But I find that awesome and really cool to look at. So Jeffrey said, are you doing any golf today? I don't think so. I certainly haven't looked at anything. The contests have just been pretty small. I know it's just really not that time of year. And I've been checking the lobby once a week. But I've been really trying to stick heavily to our contest selection principles. And until some of the lower stakes contests start to get a little bit bigger again and have a little bit more effective entrance, I haven't been playing as much. So I know it's a bit of a bummer, but I don't know. Maybe you'll inspire me and maybe I'll throw a couple lineups in here. But again, I haven't looked at a thing. So Don said, is there a way to tell SaberSim that I want more lineups with a secondary different game stack? No. So like at the moment there isn't. And that's kind of what I was saying before is in the future, we want to add the ability to say like, show me lineups where that have things like this, Hill and Cooper as kind of an opposing game stack along with the other stacks that are showing up in this lineup. And there's not really a great way to do that. You can force that to show up in 100% of your lineups if you want using an advanced stacking rule. But right now it's kind of all or nothing where you can either say, let them show up as often as that makes sense for the given contest I'm playing, or make them show up in 100% of your lineups, but very little in between there, unfortunately. So our goal here is to expand our stack types on the NFL side away from thinking that a stack just is something that includes the QB and more to including really any combinations of players playing in the same game. So like this would also be visible here too. You could see like there's 2 players from the same team in this lineup as well. And you could eliminate that if you wanted to. So that is something that we're planning on adding in the future here. Coming into week 11 here, I think some of these things that we want to add to the NFL product and to the football product overall, are definitely things that we might be looking at for next season at this point, just because we're over the halfway point, which is crazy. But anyway, Nancy Drew guy, I'm sorry, I forgot about you. I saw this question come in at the start of the stream and then I forgot about it. So I'm glad you posted it again. My apologies there. Question says, in step 3, what do you think is the most realistic percentile for each player? One of these is not more realistic necessarily than the other, right? They're all actually, what a percentile literally is that is the score that player scores. Like well, let me just set it here. Hold on. So if we set this to 85th percentile, just for example, like what this is literally doing is it is setting the projections for each player to the score that they meet or exceed 15% of the time. So like from like a realistic standpoint, or like if you're thinking about this from the probability, these are all equipped. They all have the actually exact same probability, right? Every single player in this lineup, for example, has a 15% chance to reach that point total, right? So I don't know if one of these is like more realistic than the other. The ultimate effect you get of changing your percentiles here on step 3 is you get lineups as you make this higher and higher, you get lineups that will probably have a bit more upside at the expense of average performance, right? So their average outcome may be a little bit lower at the but for the benefit of having a bit higher raw upside, right? In other words, we're looking and saying, what does this lineup score when each player in the lineup has their 15th percentile outcome, right? Or 85th percentile outcome. It scores 360. So I don't use these too much personally. I know Mr. Clean talked about here in Mr. Clean mentioned in the NHL video that he likes to use this. Oh, also, Marbrand, I saw your question come in, and I know you had a question before, so we'll get back to that as well. Mr. Clean says he likes to use these percentiles here for hockey in particular. I think in basketball, because players they're not normally distributed exactly, right? But they are the most normally distributed probably of any of the main sports. Their range of outcomes looks like a bell curve. There isn't I don't think you actually really get a lot out of changing this for basketball, right? Like the best lineups are often still the best lineups when changing the percentiles around. Whereas in higher variance sports, when players are not normally distributed, you do get a bigger impact of changing this. So anyway. Let's jump back to this question because I know I missed it. So I'm going to just read off all of these and then we'll talk about this. But Marbrand said, how is correlation determined in NBA? Is it optimal to have lineups with 3 to 4 players who play together in the NBA if Saber says they're correlated? I feel like that limits player ceilings. Then is it optimal to have, the same question. I feel like it limits their ceilings. Is there a way to get more bench players plus starting players in that case? So correlations in basketball are low, right? They're generally pretty low. I would say you're going to see almost always across the board that like your biggest correlations and smallest correlations for a given player are going to hover between like 0.1 to negative 0.1. And coupled with that, players' correlations are not consistent with one another. So like in baseball, for example, if you actually look at the correlation of any one individual hitter, if you look at Aaron Judge's correlations to the other players on his team, right? His correlations, especially to players playing in different spots of the lineup, can be as low as like 0.1, maybe to like Gleyber Torres. And he's probably a little more higher correlated to guys like Stanton, or LeMahieu or whatever. But those correlations are actually like somewhat similar. But the reason the stacking works in baseball is because all of those players have those same positive correlations with one another. And in basketball, not only are the correlations small, but they're kind of messy. So they ultimately just end up like Cade Cunningham might have this like minor small correlation to Killian Hayes and Sadiq Bey. But if we look at Bey, right, like, okay, so he has actually some of these same like correlations with some of his starters, but like they're a little bit varied. They're all small, and you don't get this big benefit really from stacking players together. Even on the negative side, right? On the average, I think a common idea here in NBA is that like two stars on the same team cannot be played together, right? In this case, actually, in our full base of simulations, Harden and Durant actually have this like very, very minor positive correlation. They're like essentially neutrally correlated, right? So the values of the correlations are generally pretty small in NBA. The slider itself on your average slate is also going to be relatively low, right? 3 moderate, factors it in a little, but coupled with the fact that the correlations themselves are already low, they don't really have a big impact on your lineups overall. I do think there is an interesting idea that like within the certain game script itself, or looking at a player's correlation at their ceiling value is interesting. And I think where that is best actually captured is in the sim variance slider, because we pull in those buckets of game simulations, which captures those game outcomes. So even if James Harden and Kevin Durant have a relatively neutral correlation across their entire spectrum of game outcomes, the way you see how does James Harden affect Kevin Durant's maximum ceiling outcome, for example, right, is captured in the game sims, right? Because in those simulations that where Harden scores 70 points, 75 points, right, you are going to accurately capture what Durant is likely to do in those game sims in the simulations themselves. And it's not always Durant fails. Like, right, sometimes there's only so many buckets to be scored, and if Harden scores 50, Durant can't score 50 also, right? Or won't very often. But what if I told you the game went to double overtime, right? Like in that case, then yeah, Harden's ceiling potential is also just as viable, right? I mean, 2 nights ago, like Luka and I was looking at the end of the night, and I know Luka and Porzingis both went off. They were both like 2 of the top 3 highest scorers, right? So like that's kind of what the neutral correlation actually means, is that yeah, there are not to say there aren't game scripts where one player succeeds at the other player's expense, but that there are so many other game scripts that balance that out, that the net effect of that is neutral. And the best way to sample that in a way that accurately reflects how often these certain game scripts come up and certain come out is to actually like make use of the simulations themselves with the sim variance slider. So like all of that to say, I would avoid lineup construction things like this where you're trying to stack certain bench players plus starting players, or limit 2 players from the same team or anything like that too much, because I think you're probably going to like overvalue this factor a little bit too much, and limit yourself from lineup constructions that are viable for that slate. We have this one lineup here in my pool of 47 where we have 4 players all from the same team, right? Like this works from a lineup construction standpoint, from the salary standpoint, from what these players score. They're not overly negatively correlated with one another. You could remove this lineup from your pool and say you don't want to play lineups that have 4 or more players from the same team. I know Max does that sometimes, and that's fine. But I would avoid getting too over concerned with lineup construction from a correlation standpoint in NBA, because I just don't think it's a huge factor. I think you'd be way better off finding your edge, and playing either like a game theory game on the ownership side of things, certainly making use of late swap, and going from there. So I think the correlation conversation, that kind of sounds cool, in NBA has allowed itself to get a little bit out of control, like around the industry. I just don't think, like, I think people are really searching for something that isn't there. And I don't know. I would be interested maybe to see, like, I don't know. The one question I have is, like, and maybe I could talk to the guys and see if we could do something like this. Like, I'm curious what James Harden's actual coefficient of correlation looks like if the game simulations were limited to those only where he scores 60 or more points. Because I'm curious what this number would look like then. That's actually an interesting idea. Maybe I'll talk to the team about that, because I'm curious. But my gut feeling is that this number is relatively reflective of any given sample of their game sims. But Marbrand says, I understand better now. Thanks. Yeah, good. I'm glad. I felt like I was maybe getting a little bit wordy there answering that one. So I'm glad I got my point across. But Pop said, been doing DFS for about 5 years now. Probably the most frustrating I've been with DFS. Just seems harder and harder to win. I mean, as tools and content and projections and everything just continues to get better, the edge, it does get harder to win. But I think it is, it's also easy to get a little bit in a bubble if you are watching streams and reading content, and you're the kind of resourceful player that goes out and looks for this kind of thing, to think that, everybody's doing this and where's the edge, and like, where can I, and in reality, that's not the case. Like, the average player out there is still doing far less than I think you might think if you're in the bubble of the DFS content space, watching videos and being involved in the SaberSim community and things like that. It's easy to kind of, I think, also just mistake some like bad run, some bad variance, some bad luck for the edge disappearing and getting smaller. Even though, it's safe to say that content and tools and projections and everything have gotten better. But I think that edge is definitely still there. And a lot of times it's just running cold there. So Don said, appears to me that SaberSim gives more same team correlation in NBA lineups than I would expect. Yeah, so one thing you can do is, if you want to, like, if you want to allow the impact of individual game outcomes to take a greater effect on your lineup, right? Like, so what we were talking about before, right? Like, we can look at Giannis and say that he's neutrally correlated with Drew Holiday, and Chris Middleton's still out, right? So he's neutrally correlated with Drew Holiday, right? And you can say, like, I want to focus more heavily on the game scripts where Giannis has a ceiling game, and then make sure I'm only using other players from that game in accordance to like what makes sense for that particular game outcome. If you want to have that effect on your lineups, right, I think the biggest thing you can do is increase the sim variance slider, which is going to like increase the value of those big ceiling outcome games, right? It buckets the games together in smaller amounts, so the impact that each individual sim has is greater, and then build lineups that way, which will like have the effect of increasing any lineup you got with a certain combination of players together. You would be able to feel a little bit more comfortable that lineup rested on a small set of game simulations, a small set of game outcomes that could take place there. But I don't know. Like, I don't know how much you need to do that. I don't know how valuable that really is. So Don says, what about raising variance and lowering correlation slightly? You could. Raising the variance slider has the impact of relatively devaluing the correlation slider a bit, right? Because again, what happens here when we're building a lineup is that based on where your sim variance slider is set, we take a bucket of game sims and then use the average that player scored in that bucket of game simulations, right? And then we couple that with ownership fade. We make an adjustment based on the player's ownership, and we start slotting players into the lineup. And then for each new player that goes into the lineup, we look at, again, that player's projection and their ownership, but then also how they correlate to the other players that are already in the lineup. And the correlation adds another additional factor. But as this variance slider goes up, the average projection that the player in question scores in that particular set of game sims is going to be generally higher, right? Because let's say you're talking about using Giannis, right? And at sim variance 8, you have like a small set of game sims and he scores 80 points in one of those game sims, right? That's going to boost up his average so much. It'll overweigh the value of any correlations that he has with the other players in the lineups and just jam him in. But at 5, right, even if he still has that 80-point game in that set of game sims, there's a lot of other games in that set also where he probably doesn't score 80, and the value of that 80-point game in that set of game sims is lower, his average is lower, and the impact of correlation as we build that lineup is higher. So yeah, I think Don says it's probably not ideal to double down on correlation. I do think you would have the impact of doubling down. So I would say if you want to value the game scripts more, you can turn variance up. I think if you wanted to actually do this, I think maybe the sharper thing to do would be to maybe consider turning ownership fade down, because you're going to allow more natural variance into your lineups. You're going to get lower owned plays here playing with a higher variance that you need to be maybe a little bit less concerned about just raw ownership fade. That's probably what I would do if you're going to go that direction. But again, the overall caveat here is that these are back-tested values, and we feel pretty confident about where these are at. So I would approach with caution, but they are also not laws. There is a reason why they are editable, and I think this is a pretty sharp thought process here of why you might want to do this. Like if you want to value the impact of correlation in your lineups more in basketball, I think it does make some sense to increase the sim variance slider as opposed to the correlation slider, because while average correlations for players are low and relatively neutral, the individual game scripts that those players play in, correlation is expressed naturally. So, but also don't be surprised if you turn your sim variance to 10 and start building lineups where Harden and Durant are both in it, because those games do exist, right? You can come up with them pretty quickly. Like, what if the game goes to overtime? What if the game goes 20 points over the implied total? Right? There are very easy ways for two players on the team to both hit their ceilings in basketball. Part of the reason why that is true too is because there's not these opportunity costs of big splash plays like there are in a sport like football. Like even just looking at football, right? The negative correlation that two skill position players have with one another is quite a bit higher, because there's an opportunity cost of every single touchdown, right? If we look at Christian McCaffrey, that's not what I meant to do. So if we look at Christian McCaffrey, right? There's only so many touchdowns that are going to be scored in this game. Every single touchdown that McCaffrey scores is going to be a touchdown that, what? Oh, there we go. That Robbie Anderson and DJ. Oh, so these actually aren't as big. Let me look at wide receivers. Depends again on the player, but yeah, I guess this is a pretty good one, right? Like minus 0.10 is like approaching a little bit of a larger negative correlation, I think. Tyreek Hill and Travis Kelce occupy very similar place here, right? Touchdown that Tyreek Hill scores is a touchdown that Travis Kelce cannot. Right. These players still can show up in the lineup together, but I think they're a little bit less likely than players like two stars on the same NBA team. So anyway. Cool. Let me double check here, make sure I didn't miss any questions here. I think we pretty much got through everything here today. So Another great stream. Thank you for everybody that tuned in. Talked about all kinds of stuff here. Talked a lot about these correlations in NBA in particular. We did some demos and walked through some tools with the entry editor and late swap. We talked about correlation from the standpoint of NFL as well, from thinking about like player groups and stacking. We talked about sliders for late swapping, actual ownership, sim variance, all kinds of stuff. We were all over the place today. Great stream. Again, I will be right back here again tomorrow at 2 p.m. Eastern. So as you are building your lineups for tonight's NBA slate or tonight's NHL slate or for golf, if you're playing a little golf, I know maybe Jeffrey's still here getting ready to start building his golf lineups. Let me know and we will tackle those questions on tomorrow's stream. In the meantime, good luck. Take care. See ya.